Give Winston Churchill the intelligence satellites, nuclear alliances, instant communications, and economic power of the modern West, and he would possess instruments beyond anything available to him in 1940. But place him inside our fractured politics, collapsing public trust, algorithmic outrage, and societies reluctant to accept sacrifice, and the question becomes far more difficult. Could Churchill still change history? Or have modern institutions and modern citizens created problems that no leader can solve alone? Whenever governments appear uncertain and public life feels smaller than the danger surrounding it, the image of Winston Churchill returns. He is remembered as the leader who recognized a threat while others searched for reassurance. The politician who gave frightening realities a language people could endure. The man who refused to treat surrender as wisdom simply because resistance was expensive. But much of this image comes from one extraordinary period, the months after he became Prime Minister in May 1940. To understand why Churchill still matters, and why imagining him in the modern world is so tempting, we must first remove the legend and return to the actual moment. Britain in 1940 was not the confident global power later films often portray. It was an imperial state with immense resources, but also profound vulnerabilities. Its army had been driven from continental Europe. Its allies were collapsing. Its cities were exposed to air attack. Its economy was under severe pressure, and its survival depended increasingly on overseas supplies crossing waters threatened by German submarines. On May 10, 1940, the day Churchill became Prime Minister, Germany invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. Within weeks, the military balance of Europe was transformed. German forces broke through the Allied position, crossed difficult terrain with speed, divided opposing armies, and pushed the British Expeditionary Force toward the Channel. More than 338,000 British and French troops were eventually evacuated from Dunkirk, an achievement that preserved the core of Britain's army. But evacuation was not victory. Heavy equipment had been abandoned. France was approaching defeat. Italy would soon enter the war on Germany's side. The Soviet Union was still bound to Berlin by the Nazi-Soviet pact. The United States remained formally outside the conflict. Britain was not choosing between an easy peace and a difficult war. It was choosing between continued resistance with uncertain prospects and some form of negotiation with a regime that had already demonstrated what its promises were worth. That decision was not obvious to everyone. Members of Britain's leadership understood that the military situation was deteriorating rapidly. Some believed the possibility of a negotiated settlement should at least be explored, perhaps through Italian mediation. Their position was not necessarily motivated by cowardice. They feared invasion, destruction, starvation, and the loss of the British Empire. They understood that continuing the war could expose millions of people to consequences no responsible government could dismiss. Churchill's importance was not that he ignored those costs. It was that he judged the alternative to be even more dangerous. His historical record suggests that he believed negotiations conducted from military weakness would not produce a stable compromise. They would produce conditions shaped by the stronger power. Britain might retain a government and a flag, but its freedom of action, alliances, military strength, and political independence could be steadily reduced. This was the central quality that made Churchill valuable in 1940. He recognized that delay and accommodation were not always the cautious options. Sometimes they merely postponed danger while allowing it to grow. Yet even here, the familiar story can become misleading. Churchill did not save Britain by standing alone in a room and speaking brilliantly. He operated through a war cabinet. He depended on Parliament. He worked with ministers from rival political parties, including Labour leaders whose support gave the coalition broader democratic legitimacy. He relied on military commanders, civil servants, intelligence analysts, engineers, factory managers, dock workers, pilots, sailors, miners, railway crews, and millions of ordinary citizens. Britain's survival also depended on institutions developed before Churchill entered Downing Street. The Royal Navy remained a formidable barrier against invasion. The Royal Air Force possessed trained personnel, organised command systems, and an integrated air defence network. Radar stations provided crucial warning of incoming attacks. Industrial planning allowed aircraft losses to be replaced. Intelligence operations slowly improved the government's understanding of German capabilities and intentions. Churchill did not create all of this. He inherited much of it. His contribution was to bring those instruments into a clear political purpose. He connected military preparation with national morale, industrial production with strategic survival, and British resistance with the possibility of future American intervention. Leadership was not a substitute for capacity. Leadership gave capacity direction. That distinction matters today because modern societies often search for a personality when the real weakness lies inside their institutions. A powerful speech cannot manufacture ammunition, repair an electrical grid, train an army, secure a supply chain, or rebuild public trust overnight. A leader can set priorities and demand action, but the state must possess the competence to turn those demands into reality. Churchill understood this better than the legend sometimes admits. He read reports constantly. He questioned officials. He sent memoranda demanding explanations, figures, and deadlines. He involved himself in military technology and production, sometimes productively and sometimes intrusively. He could exhaust those around him, interfere in matters beyond his expertise, and pursue ideas that professionals considered impractical. But he did not believe words alone would defeat Germany. He understood that morale without material power eventually becomes theatre. His public language was effective because it did not promise a painless victory. He presented struggle as long, dangerous, and costly. He acknowledged military disaster rather than disguising retreat as triumph. Even while celebrating the rescue at Dunkirk, he warned Parliament that wars were not won through evacuation. This honesty served a strategic purpose. A government asking people to endure bombing, rationing, separation, industrial discipline, and death could not build lasting morale entirely on reassurance. It needed to give sacrifice meaning without pretending that suffering was noble by itself. Churchill offered resistance as a choice between terrible alternatives, not as a glorious adventure. That is one reason his words survived. But his ability to identify danger did not suddenly appear in 1940. During much of the 1930s, Churchill occupied a politically isolated position. He warned repeatedly about German rearmament and criticised the failure of British governments to prepare more rapidly. He argued that Hitler's ambitions could not be contained through concessions alone. Some of his warnings proved disturbingly accurate. But it's too simple to describe everyone who doubted him as foolish. Britain had emerged from the First World War traumatised. Public opposition to another continental conflict was deep and understandable. The country faced economic difficulty, imperial commitments, budgetary constraints, and uncertainty about the intentions of other powers. Political leaders were under pressure to preserve peace, limit military spending, and avoid repeating the catastrophe of 1914. Churchill also carried political baggage. He had changed parties twice. He had made powerful enemies. His judgment had failed before. His enthusiasm for bold action could appear reckless. Many colleagues did not see a uniquely prophetic statesman. They saw an unstable political figure with a talent for exaggeration and a history of attaching himself to dramatic causes. The uncomfortable lesson is that being early often looks very similar to being alarmist. A democracy cannot treat every warning as truth. Governments are constantly presented with predictions of collapse, aggression, economic disaster, technological disruption, and national decline. Most cannot be answered with emergency mobilization. The difficulty lies in distinguishing the threat that is politically useful to exaggerate from the threat that will become more expensive if ignored. Churchill was right about the scale of the danger from Nazi Germany. That does not mean he was always right. His record before 1940 contained major failures, none more famous than the Dardanelles and Gallipoli campaign during the First World War. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill strongly supported an attempt to force the Straits, weaken the Ottoman Empire, and open a supply route to Russia. The operation developed into a costly disaster. Its failure cannot be attributed to Churchill alone. Responsibility was divided across political leaders, naval commanders, military planners, and confused decision-making structures. Yet his advocacy connected him permanently to the campaign. He resigned from the government and later served on the Western Front. Gallipoli revealed qualities that would follow him throughout his career: imagination, impatience, strategic ambition, and a dangerous attraction to decisive action. Those same qualities could produce necessary boldness in one situation and severe misjudgment in another. This is why the modern world must be careful when asking for another Churchill. The real Churchill was not a flawless guardian waiting for history to call him. He was a gifted, ambitious, contradictory politician shaped by the assumptions of the British Empire. He believed deeply in parliamentary government and resisted totalitarian power in Europe. At the same time, he defended imperial rule and expressed attitudes about race, hierarchy, and colonial peoples that conflict sharply with modern democratic standards. His opposition to Greater Indian self-government was intense. His hostility toward Indian nationalism placed him against political developments that were already weakening Britain's ability to maintain imperial control. During the Bengal famine of 1943, millions suffered and died amid crop losses, wartime disruption, inflation, administrative failure, transportation problems, and decisions made by both colonial and imperial authorities. Historians continue to debate the precise degree of Churchill's personal responsibility, the availability of shipping, the effect of wartime priorities, and which interventions could realistically have reduced the catastrophe. What cannot be debated away is that Churchill approached India through an imperial worldview. His government's response was part of a political system in which those experiencing the famine possessed limited power over the authorities deciding how resources would be distributed. Historical context explains those beliefs. It does not make them harmless. Nor should Churchill's failures erase the importance of 1940. A serious understanding of history must be able to hold both realities at once. A man may defend democratic freedom against one form of tyranny while denying meaningful political equality elsewhere. He may judge one historic danger correctly after making grave errors in other theatres. He may be indispensable in a crisis without becoming a moral guide for every generation. The final correction to the myth came in 1945. After leading Britain through the European War, Churchill entered a general election, expecting his wartime reputation to carry enormous political weight. Instead, the Labour Party won a decisive victory. British voters respected Churchill's leadership, but were thinking about the peace, housing, employment, healthcare, economic security, and the reconstruction of society. Many trusted Labour more to deliver that future. Churchill left office. There was no attempt to reject the legitimacy of the result. No claim that national gratitude entitled him to permanent power. No argument that defeating Hitler placed him above electoral judgment. This was not the destruction of his leadership. It was part of what he had fought to preserve. The public had the right to decide that the leader best suited to war was not necessarily the leader it wanted for reconstruction. Churchill later returned as Prime Minister, but only through the same democratic process that had removed him. That lesson may be more important than any dramatic speech. Democratic leadership is not proved only by winning power. It is also proved by accepting its limits, and those limits are becoming more fragile. Freedom House reported that global freedom declined for the 20th consecutive year in 2025. Political rights and civil liberties deteriorated in 54 countries, while only 35 recorded improvements. At the same time, global military expenditure reached approximately $2.887 trillion, the highest level recorded by SIPRI, with Europe and Asia contributing strongly to the increase. The world does not lack warnings. Governments receive intelligence assessments, satellite imagery, economic forecasts, military simulations, climate models, demographic projections, cyber threat reports, and real-time information from almost every region of the planet. Churchill often worked with incomplete intelligence delivered slowly through diplomatic cables, intercepted communications, reconnaissance, and human reports. Modern leaders can watch a crisis develop almost instantly. Yet information does not guarantee action. A democracy may know that its military reserves are inadequate and postpone investment. It may understand that its energy supplies are vulnerable and remain dependent. It may recognise foreign interference while allowing political factions to exploit the same falsehoods. It may identify the weakening of institutions, but refuse reform because every change threatens an established interest. The modern failure is often not ignorance. It is the political cost of responding to what is already known. Election cycles reward immediate benefits. Social platforms reward outrage. Bureaucracies defend existing procedures. Parties fear giving opponents an advantage. Citizens demand security, services, lower taxes, economic growth, and protection from disruption, often without accepting the costs required to sustain all of them. A leader with Churchill's instincts might begin by demanding clarity. What is the principal danger? Which national interests are essential? Which alliances would survive real pressure? What military and industrial resources actually exist? Not on paper, but in usable form. What must citizens sacrifice, and why should they believe the burden will be shared fairly? He would likely distrust strategies designed mainly to survive the next headline. His historical record suggests that he would treat language as an instrument for preparing the public, not merely flattering it. But he would encounter obstacles that rhetoric alone could not remove. Modern citizens are surrounded by more information and possess fewer shared sources of authority. Every warning is immediately accused of serving a faction. Every concession can be called surrender. Every act of preparation can be described as provocation. Every complicated decision is cut into a fragment and distributed without context. Churchill's greatness did not come from controlling history. It came from recognizing a moment when delay had become more dangerous than action. The question is whether today's world can still recognize such moments, and whether it would listen to anyone who named them. What, then, would a leader formed by Churchill's instincts actually confront in the modern world? Not one enemy advancing across a map. Not one ideology wearing a single uniform. Not one front on which victory could be measured by territory gained or armies destroyed. He would enter a system in which war and peace increasingly exist at the same time. A country may trade with another state while preparing for conflict with it. Governments can attack infrastructure without declaring war, manipulate elections without crossing a border, disable communications through cyber operations, and use private companies, proxy forces, economic pressure, satellites, and artificial intelligence as instruments of national power. The line between competition and conflict has become deliberately uncertain. Churchill understood uncertainty, but he understood it in a world where the central strategic question eventually became unmistakable. Could Nazi Germany dominate Europe, and could Britain remain independent if it did? The modern world rarely offers such clean definitions. Consider Ukraine. Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022 returned large-scale territorial war to Europe. Cities were attacked, Millions were displaced, and an independent state was forced to defend its existence against a much larger military power. Western governments supplied weapons, intelligence, training, financial support and sanctions. NATO strengthened its eastern defences while avoiding direct war between the alliance and a nuclear-armed Russia. This produced a problem Churchill would have recognised, but not one he had ever faced in precisely this form. How do you resist aggression strongly enough to prevent its success while controlling the risk of escalation between nuclear powers? The lazy comparison is to call every negotiation appeasement and every compromise another Munich. That analogy is attractive because it transforms complexity into moral certainty. It is also frequently abused. Not every hostile government is Nazi Germany. Not every territorial dispute leads to continental conquest. Not every diplomatic agreement rewards aggression. Negotiation can end wars, reduce suffering, create time for preparation, or prevent a crisis from becoming uncontrollable. Churchill himself negotiated when necessity required it. He accepted an alliance with Stalin, whose regime he deeply distrusted, because defeating Hitler took priority. He understood that foreign policy is not the art of working only with governments one admires. It is the management of power among states whose interests may overlap briefly, without their values becoming identical. But Churchill also understood that negotiation conducted without credible strength can become an organised retreat. A leader with his strategic instincts might ask whether a settlement is supported by enforceable guarantees, military capacity, political unity, and a realistic understanding of the opponent's objectives. A signed document is not a strategy if one side believes it can violate the document without serious consequence. That lesson applies far beyond Ukraine. For decades, many European governments reduced military readiness while relying heavily on American power. Defense budgets were cut, industrial production lines narrowed, ammunition stockpiles declined, and the ability to sustain a major war received less attention than the ability to deploy limited forces for shorter operations. The assumption was not irrational. Europe appeared more peaceful. Economic integration deepened. The United States remained committed to NATO. Political leaders faced competing demands for healthcare, pensions, infrastructure, education, and tax relief. But security capacity cannot be recreated instantly when danger returns. By 2025, every NATO ally had reached the alliance's earlier benchmark of spending at least 2% of national output on defence, while European allies and Canada sharply increased their investment. That change showed that democracies can respond when pressure becomes undeniable. It also exposed how much preparation had been postponed. Money announced is not the same as capability delivered. A budget cannot immediately produce trained soldiers, air defence systems, ships, maintenance crews, secure communications, or factories capable of manufacturing at wartime speed. Churchill would likely have recognised the gap between political declarations and usable power. In 1940, speeches mattered because Britain still possessed a navy, an air force, an industrial base, an empire, access to global resources, and the growing support of the United States. Resistance was courageous, but it was not imaginary. It rested on physical capacity. Modern Western countries collectively possess extraordinary wealth and technological power, yet their defence systems often depend on slow procurement, fragile production chains, specialised components, and political processes that can take years to approve what a battlefield consumes in months. The question is not simply whether the West is willing to spend, it is whether it remembers how to produce. That question becomes even more important when the focus shifts from Russia to China. China is not a modern version of Nazi Germany, and treating it as one would produce more confusion than clarity. It is a nuclear power, a central trading nation, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a technological competitor, and one of the largest economies on Earth. Western prosperity is deeply connected to Chinese manufacturing. Global companies depend on Chinese suppliers and consumers. Governments cooperate with Beijing on some issues while competing intensely on others. Yet beneath that economic relationship lies a major shift in power. China has modernized its armed forces, expanded its naval capabilities, invested heavily in missiles, space systems, cyber operations, artificial intelligence, and nuclear forces, while increasing pressure around Taiwan. The United States and its allies are trying to deter a conflict without turning deterrence itself into a path toward war. This is precisely where historical analogies become dangerous. A leader with Churchill's instincts might see the importance of early preparation, but he could not simply repeat the policies of the 1930s. China is integrated into the global economy in a way Nazi Germany never was. A confrontation could disrupt trade, finance, shipping, technology, and manufacturing across every continent before a single conventional battle was fought. Taiwan also occupies a vital place in the production of advanced semiconductors, the components required for computers, communication networks, modern vehicles, precision weapons, data centers, and artificial intelligence. A crisis in the Taiwan Strait would not remain a regional event. It could become an immediate shock to the technological foundations of the global economy. Churchill understood that national power depended on more than battlefield courage. Britain needed factories, fuel, shipping, scientific research, secure communications, and access to American production. He spent enormous political energy maintaining the relationship with the United States because he knew that British determination alone could not create the resources required for victory. A Churchillian analysis of China might therefore begin not with dramatic confrontation, but with an audit of dependence. Where are essential medicines manufactured? Who controls critical minerals? Which countries build advanced chips? Who owns the ports, data centers, communication cables, cloud systems, and satellites on which public life depends? How quickly can production be expanded during a crisis? Which alliances are supported by real logistics, and which exist mainly in diplomatic language? For many years, Western companies treated efficiency as the highest economic value. Production moved to locations where costs were lower. Inventories were reduced. Supply chains became longer and more specialized. This helped lower prices and increase profits. But what is efficient during stability may become dangerous during confrontation. A factory at home may appear expensive until access to a foreign supplier is interrupted. A reserve may appear wasteful until an emergency begins. Strategic capacity often looks inefficient because its value becomes visible only when ordinary systems fail. Churchill would probably have understood that immediately. But persuading modern voters to pay for unused capacity before a crisis would be more difficult. The benefits of preparation are invisible. The costs are immediate. That problem appears again in the information system. Churchill lived in an age of newspapers, radio, official briefings, wartime propaganda, and state censorship. Governments attempted to shape morale and control sensitive information. Rumours and enemy propaganda existed, but communication moved at a fraction of today's speed. A national speech could still become a shared event. Millions might disagree with the speaker, but they heard approximately the same words in approximately the same context. That common public space has fractured. Today, political communication is filtered through platforms that reward attention. Anger, fear, humiliation, and tribal conflict often travel faster than caution or context. A false claim can reach millions before officials have agreed on a response. A genuine video can be dismissed as artificial. An artificial video can be accepted as real. Private conversations can be leaked, shortened, rearranged, and placed before audiences that were never intended to hear them. Artificial intelligence is lowering the cost of producing persuasive synthetic content. Images, voices, documents, and apparently authentic news reports can be generated at scale. Political actors no longer need to convince an entire population. They may only need to confuse enough people that agreement becomes impossible. This is not traditional propaganda aimed at replacing one belief with another. It can be propaganda aimed at destroying the belief that truth can be known at all. Churchill was a master of public communication, but his rhetoric was supported by repetition, institutional authority, and a national crisis that created a powerful common purpose. Would he succeed in today's media environment? Possibly. His clarity, wit, historical imagination, and ability to compress a strategic argument into memorable language might make him unusually effective. He understood that political language must do more than transfer information. It must explain why events matter and what citizens are being asked to defend. But the same qualities could also be turned against him. Every verbal mistake would circulate instantly. Every contradiction from his long career would be displayed beside his latest claim. His imperial statements would provoke legitimate criticism. His drinking, personal habits, finances, political changes, and private correspondence would become permanent content. Speeches designed to unify could be divided into fragments and distributed as partisan weapons. Some audiences would celebrate him as a defender of freedom. Others would regard him as the embodiment of imperial arrogance. Still others would encounter him only through edited clips selected by people whose purpose was not understanding but emotional activation. The danger would not be that Churchill lacked words. It would be that modern society lacked a shared arena in which words could retain their meaning. He would also face a crisis of trust. Freedom House reported that political rights and civil liberties declined globally for the 20th consecutive year in 2025. The causes differ across countries: war, coups, repression, executive overreach, weakened courts, attacks on journalists, manipulation of elections, and the erosion of institutional checks. Yet democratic decline is not always announced by tanks in the capital. It can happen through gradual exhaustion. A parliament becomes less serious. A court is attacked whenever it rules against those in power. Civil servants are treated as partisan enemies. Political defeat is described as proof of conspiracy. Temporary emergency powers become permanent habits. Citizens begin to believe that institutions are legitimate only when their own side controls them. Churchill's own democratic record was complicated by empire, wartime censorship, and decisions that modern societies would challenge. But within Britain's parliamentary system, he faced opposition, questions, criticism, cabinet disagreement, and elections. He did not treat disagreement itself as treason. That distinction would matter today. Strong leadership is often confused with the removal of obstacles. But in a democracy, many obstacles are safeguards. Courts, legislatures, opposition parties, independent journalism, inspectors, and professional civil servants can frustrate a leader. They can also prevent temporary power from becoming permanent authority. A modern Churchill could not defend democracy by demanding unlimited freedom for himself. He would have to demonstrate that urgency and accountability can coexist. Then comes the question modern politicians avoid whenever possible. What can the state actually afford? Global public debt rose to nearly 94% of world economic output in 2025. Many wealthy societies also face aging populations, greater pension and healthcare costs, infrastructure needs, defense requirements, energy transitions, and public expectations built during periods of lower interest rates. Debt is not automatically evidence of decline. Governments borrow to fight recessions, build infrastructure, respond to emergencies, and invest in future growth. Churchill's Britain could not have sustained the war without enormous borrowing and American support. The danger comes when permanent promises expand faster than national productivity, and political leaders refuse to explain the trade-offs. A country cannot indefinitely demand stronger defence, lower taxes, larger benefits, cheaper energy, greater industrial subsidies, and no reduction in private consumption without eventually discovering that arithmetic is not an ideology. A leader with Churchill's instincts might insist that commitments be matched by resources, but would citizens reward such honesty? Political systems often encourage leaders to promise protection from every cost. Sacrifice is described as temporary, even when the challenge is permanent. New programs are announced without sufficient administrative capacity. Defence strategies are published without ammunition. Industrial plans are launched without skilled workers, reliable energy, or realistic approval processes. The gap between promise and execution becomes a form of national self-deception. Churchill could describe sacrifice with unusual force because the threat was visible and immediate. Modern leaders must often ask citizens to pay now for dangers that remain uncertain. Military deterrence, cyber defence, resilient supply chains, climate adaptation, public health reserves, or the control of emerging technologies. Preparation looks excessive until the day it looks inadequate. And the technologies involved are increasingly controlled by private power. During Churchill's lifetime, industrialists, newspaper owners, scientists, bankers, and weapons manufacturers exercised enormous influence. The British government depended on private factories and expertise, especially during mobilisation. But today some companies operate systems that resemble strategic infrastructure. Private firms control cloud computing, satellite communications, social platforms, advanced AI models, undersea data services, launch capabilities, and enormous stores of personal information. A commercial decision made by a small number of executives can affect military operations, public debate, government communications, or an entire country's access to digital services. Churchill would likely have welcomed innovation that increased national power. He had a strong interest in science, military technology, intelligence, and unconventional ideas. But he would also have encountered a constitutional problem. How can democratic governments depend on private technology without allowing private owners to determine foreign policy? How can states regulate strategic companies without destroying the innovation they need? Who is accountable when an algorithm influences elections, when a satellite network becomes essential to an army, or when an artificial intelligence company develops systems with national security consequences beyond the understanding of most lawmakers? No speech can settle these questions. They require legislation, technical expertise, international coordination, and institutions capable of supervising power they did not create. The modern world would give Churchill extraordinary advantages. Advanced intelligence, rapid communications, established alliances, enormous combined wealth, global surveillance, precision weapons, and scientific capacities beyond anything his generation could imagine. It would also impose limits he could not overcome by force of personality. Nuclear escalation, economic interdependence, fragmented media, legal restraints, weakened trust, and societies that demand security while resisting many of the costs required to provide it. Churchill might help the modern West identify what it feared. He might force governments to compare their promises with their actual strength. He might argue that alliances survive only when members prepare to defend one another, and that diplomacy becomes more effective when opponents believe commitments will be honoured. But he would still face the central contradiction of modern power. The modern world may possess more power than Churchill ever commanded. What it may lack is agreement about what that power is for. Churchill could matter in the modern world. That answer should not be dismissed merely because history never repeats itself exactly, or because the cult of the heroic leader can become dangerous. Individuals do change events. They identify possibilities that institutions have overlooked. They force governments to confront questions they would prefer to postpone. They give scattered fears a coherent meaning. At rare moments, they alter what societies believe is possible, and what enemies believe those societies are prepared to endure. A leader with Churchill's instincts might bring greater clarity to Western strategy. He might ask why democratic governments announce commitments that their industries, budgets, and political systems are not prepared to support. He might challenge allies that demand American protection while avoiding responsibility for their own defense. He might remind the United States that alliances are not acts of charity, but instruments through which national power is multiplied. He might connect military readiness to energy, manufacturing, technology, education, infrastructure, and public finance. He would likely understand that a defense strategy is not a list of weapons. It is a system capable of producing, transporting, maintaining, replacing, and operating those weapons over time. He might also restore a missing element to political communication: the willingness to tell citizens that security has a price. Modern political language often treats the public as a customer. Every policy must be presented as a benefit. Every transition is described as painless. Every military commitment will supposedly be limited. Every economic reform will create winners without producing losers. Every new promise can be funded without affecting older promises. Churchill's greatest speeches did not speak to people that way. He treated the public as participants in a national decision. That did not make every claim accurate or every policy wise. But it recognized a fundamental principle. Democratic citizens cannot be expected to defend a political order if they are never told what threatens it, what preserving it requires, or why the burden is worth carrying. A modern leader with that instinct might refuse to confuse delay with peace. He might recognize that postponing preparation can be more provocative than preparing early, because visible weakness encourages opponents to test how far they can advance. He might insist that diplomacy must be supported by capability, but also that strength exists to make political settlements possible, not to turn every rivalry into permanent war. He might bring urgency to governments that have learned to treat every crisis as a communications exercise. But urgency alone would not be enough. Churchill could not personally reverse demographic decline. He could not create millions of skilled workers through determination. He could not eliminate decades of accumulated public debt with a speech. He could not force sovereign allies to accept identical risks, priorities, or sacrifices. He could not make social media truthful. He could not guarantee that artificial intelligence would serve democracy rather than manipulation. He could not place every satellite, cloud network, semiconductor factory, communications platform, and private technology company under one coherent national command without creating dangers of his own. Above all, he could not control nuclear escalation as if it were another military variable. The existence of nuclear weapons changes the meaning of courage. A leader must demonstrate resolve while preserving channels through which catastrophe can still be avoided. Refusing every compromise may appear strong until the consequences become irreversible. Threatening action is useful only when the action is both credible and politically rational. Churchill understood risk, but some of his strategic instincts were formed in an age when great powers could enter total war and still imagine victory as a survivable condition. That assumption can no longer be made. A modern Churchill would also face resistance rooted not merely in partisan hostility, but in his own record. His imperial views would not disappear because his wartime leadership remained impressive. His language about colonized peoples, his opposition to Indian self-government, his willingness to use coercive imperial power, and the controversies surrounding decisions made during his career would all be part of the public judgment. That opposition would not be an unfortunate distraction from his greatness. Much of it would be legitimate. A democratic society must be capable of honoring courage without turning admiration into immunity. Historical achievement does not cancel historical harm. The fact that Churchill defended parliamentary government against fascism does not require former colonies or their descendants to treat his imperial worldview as irrelevant. Some of his methods would be unacceptable today, others would be ineffective. A politician shaped by the governing habits of the early 20th century could not simply enter the modern world and assume that authority, hierarchy, and national prestige would command obedience. The public would question him. Courts might restrict him. Parliament could defeat him. Allies might reject his demands. Journalists would investigate him. Citizens would attack his assumptions about class, race, empire, and national power. That would not necessarily prove that democratic society had become too weak to accept leadership. It might prove that democratic standards had expanded. The desire for a new Churchill can therefore conceal a deeper avoidance. People often search for a heroic leader when they do not want to examine the responsibilities of citizenship. They imagine that one extraordinary personality could repair the military, discipline the bureaucracy, restore trust, defeat propaganda, reform public finances, rebuild industry, manage alliances, control technology, and persuade millions of people to place national duty above personal preference. But democracy cannot be permanently rescued by personality. It requires competent institutions that continue working after the great speech ends. It requires civil servants capable of turning policy into administration. Legislatures capable of examining power without reducing every hearing to partisan performance. Courts whose authority survives unpopular decisions. Journalists who value verification more than access or outrage. Opposition parties that challenge governments without treating the state itself as an enemy. It requires leaders who can lose elections without claiming that the political system becomes illegitimate whenever it rejects them. Churchill's defeat in 1945 remains important precisely because it separates democratic leadership from personal rule. The British public could admire his wartime service and still choose another government for the peace. The institutions he defended were meaningful because they allowed citizens to remove him. A leader who claims to embody the nation so completely that electoral rejection becomes betrayal is not preserving democracy. He is preparing to replace it. An informed public matters as much as honourable leadership. Citizens do not need to become military experts, economists, or constitutional scholars. But a free society cannot function when political identity becomes more important than evidence. When a lie is forgiven because it assists one's own side, while every fact produced by an opponent is rejected automatically. Democracy depends on disagreement. It cannot survive the permanent destruction of shared reality. Nor can it survive if citizens withdraw completely from public responsibility and then express surprise when organised minorities, wealthy interests, ideological movements or authoritarian personalities occupy the space they abandon. Voting alone is not enough. Institutions require attention before they fail. Local government, schools, courts, public agencies, professional standards, community organisations, and independent media often appear unglamorous. Their importance becomes visible only after corruption, incompetence, or political capture has weakened them. The search for a saviour begins where institutional maintenance ends. This brings us to the most uncomfortable phrase in the question: has the world chosen its crisis? Does the world deserve the disorder it now faces? No. Ordinary people do not deserve invasion because their governments miscalculated. Children do not deserve poverty because institutions failed. Citizens do not deserve repression because opposition parties were divided. Communities do not deserve corruption, forced displacement, political violence, or the destruction of their homes. Suffering is not a moral payment owed by populations judged insufficiently serious. But political consequences do not wait for moral permission. A society can contribute to its own decline without deserving the suffering that follows. It happens when truth becomes less important than tribal loyalty, when political lies carry no lasting cost because supporters treat every exposure as an attack from the enemy, when comfort is preferred to preparation even after the danger has become visible, when governments promise permanent security while allowing the industrial, financial, and institutional foundations of that security to weaken, when every compromise is called betrayal and every opponent is treated as a traitor, when citizens accept attacks on democratic safeguards because those attacks temporarily benefit their preferred faction, when long-term risks are postponed so that present-day voters do not have to pay, change, or reconsider. The world does not deserve suffering, but neglected weaknesses accumulate. Eventually, they narrow the range of peaceful choices available. Churchill's own career offers an important distinction between avoiding war and postponing it under worse conditions. He did not believe every conflict was inevitable. He believed that unchecked aggression could make a later conflict more likely and more destructive. That principle can be abused by leaders seeking justification for confrontation. It can also be ignored by leaders who call every delay prudence. The challenge is to prepare without becoming addicted to threat, to deter without humiliating, to negotiate without pretending that all intentions are peaceful, and to build power without allowing power to become the only measure of political success. Churchill's significance did not end when the fighting stopped. After the war, he argued for a more durable European order. In his 1946 speech in Zurich, he called for a form of European unity built around reconciliation, especially between France and Germany. He supported the broader movement that contributed to the development of the Council of Europe and continued to stress the importance of cooperation among Western democracies. He also warned publicly about Soviet expansion and argued for close transatlantic partnership. These positions were not without contradictions. Churchill imagined Britain as connected to several overlapping spheres: Europe, the Commonwealth and Empire, and the English-speaking partnership with the United States. His vision was not identical to the European Union that later emerged, nor was he the sole architect of post-war cooperation. European reconstruction depended on many leaders, institutions, officials, parties, workers, and electorates. American economic power, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the United Nations, European integration, and the eventual reconciliation of former enemies were collective achievements shaped by circumstances larger than Churchill. But his post-war thinking revealed something essential. He understood that military victory without political reconstruction could prepare the conditions for another disaster. Defeating an enemy was not enough. The peace had to create habits of cooperation, credible deterrence, economic recovery, and institutions through which rival national interests could be managed without returning constantly to war. That lesson remains urgent. The Western alliance cannot survive only as a memory of past victories. International institutions cannot remain legitimate merely because they were founded with noble intentions. Rules that are not enforced become suggestions. Alliances that are not maintained become ceremonies. Democracies that cannot produce security, prosperity, or competent government eventually weaken their own moral claims. Yet order must not become an excuse for domination. A stable international system cannot be preserved by demanding that smaller nations surrender their independence whenever powerful states find it convenient. Nor can democratic governments defend freedom abroad while steadily hollowing it out at home. Strength without principle becomes coercion. Principle without strength becomes performance. Churchill's best leadership emerged when political purpose, public language, institutional capacity, military preparation, and alliance strategy moved in the same direction. His failures often emerged when ambition escaped restraint, when imperial assumptions distorted judgment, or when boldness became detached from a realistic understanding of consequences. That is why recreating Churchill is neither possible nor desirable. The modern world does not need his habits, prejudices, and policies copied into a century he never knew. It needs to recover the qualities that made his strongest leadership possible while rejecting the parts of his legacy that conflict with equal citizenship and democratic self-government. Clarity without panic. The ability to identify danger without turning fear into a permanent political weapon. Strength without the worship of force. Military and industrial capacity designed to deter conflict, not make conflict emotionally attractive. Alliances without illusion. Partnerships built on shared interests and responsibilities, not on the assumption that friendly language can erase national differences. Patriotism without the destruction of democracy. A belief in one's country strong enough to defend its institutions, but not so absolute that criticism becomes disloyalty or electoral defeat becomes treason. Ambition disciplined by reality. The courage to attempt difficult things while remaining capable of hearing experts, recognizing limits, and changing course when evidence demands it. And honesty about the price of freedom. A free society requires defense, functioning institutions, public trust, economic productivity, political restraint, and citizens willing to protect rules even when those rules benefit their opponents. Churchill might change the direction of several modern debates. He might expose the emptiness of commitments unsupported by resources. He might strengthen alliance confidence. He might accelerate military and industrial preparation. He might communicate danger with greater force than leaders trained to speak only through approved slogans and carefully tested phrases. He might remind democratic societies that morale is not an emotion separate from strategy. It is the belief that sacrifice has a purpose, that leaders understand the danger, that institutions are capable of acting, and that burdens will not be imposed only on those with the least power to resist them. But Churchill could not rescue a society determined to remain divided, distracted, and unwilling to bear costs. No leader can maintain seriousness indefinitely on behalf of citizens who reward fantasy. No speech can rebuild trust where every institution is attacked for temporary advantage. No alliance can remain credible when its members want protection without responsibility. No democratic system can survive if victory becomes more important than constitutional restraint. A leader can give language to courage. He cannot manufacture courage forever in people who reject responsibility. So, could Churchill change the world today? Perhaps he could change its direction. He might make danger harder to ignore. He might force governments to prepare sooner. He might persuade allies that hesitation had reached its limit. In a decisive crisis, his presence could alter calculations in capitals, military headquarters, markets, and public opinion. But he could not save the modern world alone. History is not redirected by great men acting above society. It changes when leadership, institutions, and citizens become serious at the same moment. When warnings are matched by preparation. When power is matched by purpose. When citizens demand honesty and accept that honest policies sometimes carry costs. When leaders defend democratic rules even when those rules limit their own authority. The modern world does not need to bring Winston Churchill back. It needs to understand why his leadership mattered when it did, and why even he depended on institutions, alliances, workers, soldiers, experts, and a public willing to continue when the outcome was uncertain. Churchill might still recognise the danger. The greater question is whether we would recognise the truth in time, and whether we would act before crisis made the choice for us.